The laughter started before she had finished speaking. It was not the laughter of men who found something genuinely funny. It was the other kind, the kind that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with power. The kind that said, "We have already decided what you are, and what you are is not this." Sergeant First Class Deering had heard that particular laugh before. She had heard it at Fort Bragg when she qualified expert on the M24. She had heard it at Grantham when she outshot an entire platoon on the 300-meter range. She had learned, over 11 years of service, to let it pass through her like wind through chain link. It moved through. It did not stay. What she had not expected on this particular Tuesday morning at CFB Wainwright was to hear it from a full-bird colonel. Deering was 34 years old. She had spent the better part of a decade and a half developing a skill set that most people in the building could not name, let alone replicate. She held a secondary MOS in long-range precision fire that she had earned the hard way, not through assignment, but through a program she had requested 3 times before anyone took the paperwork seriously. She was 5'6", brown-haired, unremarkable in every visual sense that military institutions tend to rely on for first impressions. She was also, by any measurable standard, the best long-range shooter currently assigned to the Ranger Task Force rotation operating out of that base. None of that was visible to Colonel Vieth on the morning in question. What was visible to Vieth was a female staff sergeant sitting in the third row of a briefing room full of male Rangers, raising her hand to volunteer for a job that his senior NCO had just described, without particular delicacy, as not a woman's problem to solve. The problem itself was straightforward enough, in the way that impossible things sometimes appear straightforward when written on a whiteboard. There was a target. The target was a known hostile intelligence asset who had been operating out of a compound in a semi-urban training analog. This was an exercise, officially, though the intelligence underpinning it was not. The asset had a protection detail, a disciplined overwatch, and a pattern of movement that made close-range interdiction nearly impossible without unacceptable collateral risk. The solution, Vieth's senior sniper team leader, Grantham, had explained, was a long-range shot from an elevated position to the northwest. The problem was that the shot was 3,800 meters, and in 6 days of attempts by 3 different 2-man sniper teams, including Grantham himself, the target had not been neutralized. Not once. Grantham had not announced his failures in those terms. He had called them environmental complications and ballistic variables requiring further assessment. He had a talent for language that way, the kind of talent that translated difficulty into something that sounded like methodology. Deering had listened to this explanation with the neutral expression of someone who had learned that expressions, in rooms like this one, were a kind of currency that had to be spent carefully. When Vieth opened the floor, she raised her hand. The laughter, as noted, preceded her second sentence. "Sergeant," Vieth said, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man exercising restraint he was privately proud of. "What exactly is your current role on this deployment?" "Intelligence support, sir. Secondary qualified in long-range precision fire. I've held the qualification for 4 years. And you believe that qualifies you too? I'd like the opportunity to attempt the shots, sir. I'm not asking to lead the team. I'm asking to take the position." Grantham, who was seated to Vieth's left, did not laugh. He did something Deering thought was in some ways worse. He looked at his hands. He was a man who had trained for 15 years, who had 2 combat deployments, and a confirmed engagement record that he did not talk about, but that everyone knew. And he looked at his hands the way a man looks at something he is trying not to be responsible for. "We'll consider it," Vieth said, which was not an answer. What it was, as Deering understood perfectly well, was a dismissal dressed in the grammar of consideration. She had not grown up wanting to shoot things. This was a point of some confusion to people who heard her story later. The assumption being that a woman who became, by some measures, one of the most precise long-range shooters in her branch must have arrived at that skill through some obvious origin, some formative moment involving a grandfather's rifle or a rural upbringing or some early trauma that needed an outlet. None of that was true of Deering. She had grown up in Sudbury, Ontario, in a house with no guns and parents who were, by any measure, aggressively ordinary. Her father taught secondary school mathematics. Her mother managed the administrative office of a medical clinic. There was nothing in her childhood that pointed toward any of this. What she had was patience, not the performative patience of someone who had been told that patience was a virtue and was trying their best to embody it. The other kind, structural kind, the kind that lived in the nervous system rather than the will. She could wait. She could wait in a way that most people, including most soldiers, found genuinely uncomfortable to witness. She could hold a position, physical or psychological, without the internal erosion that tended to accompany prolonged stillness in people who were not built for it. She had joined the Canadian Forces at 22, transferred under a bilateral program to work alongside U.S. Army Ranger elements at 26, and had spent the years since then doing the kind of work that accumulates slowly and shows up, if it shows up at all, in evaluation reports that are read by people who don't quite know what they're reading. Her secondary qualification had come from a program she'd found in a training catalog that most people skip past. She had applied. She had been told the program was not typically accessed by personnel in her current role. She had applied again in writing with a rationale she had spent 2 weeks drafting. She had been accepted on the third cycle, and she had finished first in her cohort by a margin that her instructor, a retired warrant officer named Featherstone, had described in his debrief as statistically notable. Featherstone had told her, on the last day, that she had a gift for understanding wind. She had not known what to do with that observation at the time. Later she understood it. Wind was, at its core, a problem of information, of reading a system that was constantly changing and making a decision based not on what the system was doing now, but on what it would be doing at the moment the bullet arrived. Most shooters, even good ones, solved for current conditions. Deering solved for the interval. It was a small conceptual difference and an enormous practical one. She had never had the opportunity to apply it at anything beyond 1,600 meters in a live or live analog context. 2,800 meters was, in that sense, genuinely new territory. She thought about that the night after the briefing, sitting on her cot in the temporary quarters block, looking at the ceiling. Not with anxiety particularly, more with the focused attention of someone who has been handed a problem they have been, without knowing it, preparing for. The message came at 0340, not from Vieth, from Grantham. It said, "Meet me at the range annex at 0500. Come alone. Bring your kit." She was there at 0450. Grantham was already set up when she arrived. Tripod, spotting scope, a thermal imager on a secondary mount. He was a tall man, angular in the way of people who don't eat enough, with the kind of stillness that came not from her type of patience, but from something more deliberate, more chosen. He had spent a long time becoming still. She could tell the difference. He did not say good morning. He handed her a data card. "Environmental readings from the last 6 attempts," he said. "Wind data, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients across the flight path. I want you to look at them and tell me what you see." She looked. She took 7 minutes, which he did not rush. When she looked up, she said, "You've been correcting for the surface wind. The gradient differential at range is running about 12% higher than surface. It's shifting the terminal phase left of the adjusted solution." Grantham was quiet for a moment. "That's what I thought," he said. "I wanted to hear someone else say it. Why didn't you correct for it?" "I did, on the last attempt. I still missed." "By how much?" 40 centimeters high. Deering turned back to the data card. "What was the temperature gradient on that attempt?" He told her. She did some arithmetic in her head that most people would have needed a ballistics calculator for. Then she said, "You were using a standard Coriolis correction for this latitude. You need the composite. The elevation differential between the firing position and the target is running the spindrift into the thermal layer. You have to account for both simultaneously." Grantham looked at her. "Can you do that in real time?" he asked. "Not on paper, in position, in actual conditions." "I don't know," she said. "I've never had occasion to find out." It was honest in a way that he seemed to appreciate. He nodded. He picked up his radio. The call to Vieth, as Deering would learn later, was not a request. It was a declaration. Grantham had told the colonel, in terms that Grantham was known for using when he had made up his mind about something, that they were running out of window and out of options, and that he had a shooter he believed could solve the ballistic problem, and that the shooter's name was Sergeant First Class Deering, and that he was recommending they give her the shot. Vieth's response, according to the radio operator who was present, had been a silence of approximately 8 seconds, followed by, "Get it done." The position was 3 kilometers to the northwest, on a ridgeline that the advance element had used on 2 of the previous attempts. It was not ideal. The approach was exposed for the final 400 meters, and the wind channeled unpredictably through a draw to the south that created interference patterns that did not appear in the standard atmospheric modeling. Deering knew this because she had spent the previous 36 hours between duties reading every environmental report that had been filed on the position. She had also spent 2 hours the previous evening lying in the prone position in an empty corner of the vehicle park, not shooting, just breathing, adjusting the way her body distributed its weight across the equipment, finding the specific geometry that would let her hold the position for the time it would take. It was not glamorous preparation. No one had seen her do it. That was, in some sense, the point. The rifle was a system she had not used operationally at this range, a variant of the MRAD platform that the team had been running, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. She had fired 280 rounds through it over 3 sessions in the preceding week, not because she needed the familiarization, but because she needed to know exactly how this particular barrel harmonized at the upper end of its effective range. Every barrel was different. Every barrel had a personality at distance, a tendency, a preference. She had learned this one. At 06 Phi, she moved to the position with Grantham spotting and a second spotter, a quiet corporal named Tischler, on the thermal. The target would be visible for approximately 90 seconds, based on the pattern analysis. There would be no second window that day. If the shot didn't happen in that interval, the exercise clock would expire, and Vieth would have to make a decision about requesting an extension, a conversation that, Deering understood, he very much did not want to have. She settled into position. The wind at the surface was running 11 kilometers per hour from the northwest, with a slight shift toward the north that had been building over the previous 20 minutes. At altitude, the shot crossed a ridgeline at roughly 1,100 meters of the flight path. The gradient data suggested a different story. She had spent an hour that morning running calculations on the compound effect. She had a solution. She was not certain it was right. She was as certain as she could be given the information available, which was a different thing and a more honest one. Grantham made no comment. That was his way of communicating confidence. At 0638, the target became visible. What happened in the next 47 seconds is the kind of thing that does not translate well into language, because the important parts of it were not words or thoughts or decisions in the usual sense. They were adjustments, micro-corrections made at a level below conscious deliberation, the product of years of pattern recognition operating faster than reflection. Deering's heart rate, which had been sitting at 58 beats per minute, did not change. Her breathing slowed through a familiar cycle. The world, in the specific and limited way that it becomes available to a shooter in that moment, narrowed to a set of relationships between wind and distance and gravity and time. She broke the shot. In the spotting scope, Grantham watched the trace. He did not say anything immediately. What he said, after a pause of perhaps 4 seconds that felt, to the people present, considerably longer, was "target down." And then a moment later, something that was not quite professional in the standard sense, something that crossed the line between assessment and genuine response. "That," he said, "is the cleanest solution I have ever seen run at this distance, and I've seen a few." Tischler, behind his thermal scope, let out a breath that he had apparently been holding since the shot broke. The debrief happened at 1100. Vieth ran it, as he always did, with efficiency and without decoration. He went through the exercise parameters, the environmental conditions, the timeline, the outcome. He used the passive voice in the way that military debriefs tend to use the passive voice. The shot was taken, the target was neutralized, which had the effect of distributing credit across the event rather than locating it in a person. When he got to the performance assessment section, he paused. The room, there were 14 people in it, 12 of them male, was quiet in a particular way. The particular way that a room is quiet when people are paying attention to what is not being said as much as to what is. Vieth looked at the paper in front of him. Then he looked at Deering. "The solution you ran," he said. "Walk me through it." She did. She explained the gradient differential, the composite Coriolis correction, the way she had modeled the thermal layer interference, the adjustment she had made in the final seconds based on a wind shift that Grantham had called just before she settled. Her natural respiratory pause. She used precise language without jargon where jargon was unnecessary. She was not performing expertise. She was explaining work. When she finished, Vieth was quiet for a moment. "Who taught you the composite correction?" he asked. "I worked it out from first principles," she said. "The standard model didn't account for the elevation differential. I needed it to." Another pause. That's not in the standard curriculum, Vieth said. No, sir. Where did you learn to identify that it was necessary? I read the failure data, she said. All 6 attempts. The pattern was there. Vieth looked at Grantham. Grantham looked back at him with the expression of a man who had already had this conversation with himself and arrived at a position. She read the failure data, Vieth repeated, not sarcastically, almost to himself, as if he was locating something he had misplaced. What happened next was not an apology. Vieth was not, by any account, a man who apologized in the conventional sense, and Deering was not waiting for one. What happened was something more durable than an apology, a shift in the quality of attention in the room. Grantham, who had watched this happen before, recognized it. It was the moment when a fact becomes too large to manage with anything but acknowledgement. Sergeant First Class Deering, Vieth said, your performance today was exceptional. I want a full written technical report on the ballistic solution by 1700. We'll be incorporating it into the standard shooting doctrine review. Yes, sir. Grantham, sir. I want her on the next rotation. Primary shooter. The room was quiet again, but it was a different quiet. Not the quiet of a room waiting to see what a woman would do under pressure. The quiet of a room that had already seen it. She called her father that evening from outside the temporary quarters block. The sun was going down over the Alberta plains in the particular way it goes down in late August, all orange and unhurried, with the kind of space around it that cities don't allow. She did not tell him about the shot. She told him she'd had a good day. He told her about a problem one of his students was having with quadratic equations and asked if she remembered the method he used to teach it with the colored chalk. She did remember. She told him. After she hung up, she sat for a while in the cooling air and watched the light change. The achievement was real. She knew that. Grantham's acknowledgement was real, and Vieth's reassignment was real. And the report she would write would become part of a doctrine that would outlast this particular deployment by a considerable margin. Those were not small things, but she had been in this position before, not at 2,800 meters, not with this specific set of eyes watching, but in the essential sense. She had done the work. The work had been seen, and tomorrow she would do it again, in a context where she would likely have to establish the same fact to a different room of people who had not been present today. That was the part that didn't end. Not the achievement, the establishing. She was patient enough for it. She had always been patient enough for it. What she felt, sitting in the Alberta evening with the sound of the bass winding down around her, was not bitterness and not quite resignation and not quite peace. It was something more precise than any of those words. The specific, calibrated acceptance of a person who has decided that the work itself is worth doing, regardless of the conditions under which it has to be done. Grantham came out of the building at some point and stood near her without speaking. He was holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. Doc Review passed it up the chain, he said. The composite model. They want to know who derived it. It's in the report. I know. I wanted to tell you myself. She held the cup in both hands. The coffee was bad, in the way that coffee at Wainwright was reliably bad, and she drank it anyway. You knew, she said, in the briefing. You knew I could do it. I thought you could, he said. There's a difference. What changed it from thought to know? Grantham looked out at the same fading light she had been looking at. The data card, he said. 7 minutes, no calculator. You told me the gradient differential before I'd finished handing it to you. He paused. I've been doing this for 16 years. I'd have needed 12 minutes and a computer. She did not say anything. You should have been running a primary position 2 years ago, he said. Not with anger, but with the matter-of-fact quality of an assessment that has been delayed but not lost. I should have flagged it. You flagged it today, she said. That's not the same. No, she agreed. But it's what happened. Grantham finished his coffee and went back inside without the kind of closing statement that men who are uncomfortable with their own admissions tend to reach for. She appreciated that about him. He had learned somewhere along the way, when a thing had been said enough. She stayed outside until the last of the light was gone. Then she went in, sat at the field desk in the corner of her quarters, opened her laptop, and started writing the report. The window was dark behind her. The base was quiet. She wrote clearly and precisely and without any of the hedging that technical documentation sometimes accumulated when the person writing it was trying to protect something other than the truth. It took her 3 hours. At the end, she read it through once, made 2 corrections, and submitted it. Then she turned off the light and went to sleep. Tomorrow had its own requirements. She intended to meet them.